何千何万という敵味方の中で唯一お前だけが俺に夢を忘れさせた。捧げる。
It began with the forging of the great rings. 3 were given to the elves, immortal, wisest and fairest of all beings. 7.
Blurring the lines between good and evil in fantasy has been a steady progression since the inception of the genre, although the real question is both how, why and to what degree has this line been blurred. The true frame for all storytelling, no matter what format nor what genre, is the contrast and conflict between good and evil, whether this be clearly interpreted as a steep divide, for instance like Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, or perhaps leaning towards ideals rather than tangible beings, for example depression versus hope. In this video essay I shall investigate the progression of good and evil in fantasy in order to further illustrate Martin F. Norden's idea, in order to finally answer the questions of why and how the face of evil has become progressively less and less detached with its counterpart, that of course being good. Before we can begin, we must first understand what is fantasy in film and how is the divide of good and evil first established. The origins of fantasy dates back to the old Greek and Roman myths, with tales such as Medusa and Hercules. According to the data, the first fantasy film was released as early as 1901, that film being The Magic Sword, a medieval fantasy. The question is, why does The Magic Sword, a medieval fantasy, fit this given mould of a fantasy film? The two interpretations indicate towards the idea that there are no true definition for a fantasy film. Perhaps it is to be a fantasy film one must merely involve the creation of a far-off land which starkly contrasts our daily life in the real world. Although if we follow this idea, then wouldn't a film such as Star Wars be viewed as a fantasy film, even though so many consider it to be a sci-fi one? Does a film need to be about knights and dragons, such as the works of Lord of the Rings? Although once again, following this ideology would abandon works such as Harry Potter as not being classified as fantasy, because they take place in a rather modern setting. Another theory I found being debated online suggests the fantasy genre is a screwed representation of the real world, which lacks both scientific and Murakami themes. If a fantasy tale cannot contain themes of Murakami, in layman's terms themes of death, then the same works of fiction almost no one would argue about being classified under the fantasy genre would once again be left out. George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones, Kentaro Milo's Berserk, Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian are to name just a few examples of works that would no longer be considered as part of the fantasy genre. One of the most highly esteemed and well-renowned fantasy films of all time, that being Lord of the Rings, contains many key themes linking to good and evil in fantasy. As standard, the film contains several ideal archetypes of good and evil, such as Frodo, Gandalf, Sauron and the Witch King and many others. However, none of these evolve the standard prototype, nor do they blur the line between the two. Instead, one character which does this is often the one overlooked by the majority of both audiences and experts alike. What is this character, you may ask? It is none other than the One Ring itself. Standing far separated from its cohorts, the Ring is an evil, untouched by light. After all, characters such as the Witch King and the Nazgul are mere puppets warped by its sinister nature. The Ring does not only push the concepts of good and evil further by creating a non-humanoid character, but it also stands as the first of many steps to blurring the line between yin and yang in film. Benevolent heroes or warful tyrants, none may resist the calling of the Ring. This is a clear-cut example of good and evil mixing together, with pure and heroic characters ranging from Bilbo Baggins to Boromir and Isildur, all finding themselves seduced by the manipulations of the Ring. And yet it is not as simple as a good character turning bad, but instead a good character believing they may use the Ring to induce good, when in truth they shall only spell chaos and bloodshed. Boromir perhaps is the best example, wishing to use the Ring to fight the armies of Isengard and Mordor, which on a base level boils down to fighting evil with evil, but with good intentions. This marks a landmark in the fantasy genre, one showcasing the line separating good and evil is slowly growing frailer. Martin F. Norden's theory of the changing face of evil is partially proven twice with Lord of the Rings alone, as not only does the evil change its traditional face of a humanoid creature, instead taking the form of a ring, but it too blends the face of evil with that of good, giving birth to something new entirely. Showcasing the character as Boromir, as a conflicted man containing forces of both good and evil trapped within him, with the good intentions performing evil actions in order to achieve them. Pre-Lord of the Rings, you would be hard-pressed to discover a portrayal of good and evil that was not plain and constructed to be little more than one-dimensional. This lack of unique character motivations and overall story dynamic is blatant with films such as Snow White, where the villain, the Evil Queen, is merely evil for the sake of it. She has no redeeming qualities and merely wishes to kill Snow White, so none may appear more beautiful than herself. This is how the concept of evil was portrayed for much of early fantasy films. A simple, one-dimensional villain who had little to no sympathetic backstory or compelling motivation, nor bearing any kind of understandable goal. Heroes were no better, simply being good for the sake of being good, although at times, such as with Beauty and the Beast, we see the heroes go through some sort of change, with the Beast growing warmer and less disjointed with Belle and the outside world. Taking this into account, not only can we prove good and evil was portrayed rather bland and unrealistic, but more importantly, the divide between the two was extreme and vast, to say the least, keeping character types stuck in a fixed point, unable to evolve or grow in order to be more dynamic in the slightest. The quotation signifies an expert in storytelling, the great Peter Jackson and his educated opinion on how fantasy tales should be told, choosing that it should replicate the real world while sharing fantasy and imaginative elements, and using this ideology, good and evil in fantasy needed to change the divide between the two, and it needed to be torn down, because in the real world, people are not merely good or bad for no reason, nor is one person all good or all bad. Instead, we are all a combination of the two, with reasons to explain that, whether it be something in our own pasts or a goal we are building toward. One of my favourite examples of realism portrayed in the fantasy genre for good and evil is with the character Davy Jones from Pirates of the Caribbean, once a captain who loved somebody so much that he gave up his life and all eternity of servitude, also that he could see them once every 10 years to meet his love again. However, once she failed to show, he would fall into madness, abandoning his duty and becoming a vicious monster who now laughs at the idea of love altogether. This is a much more realistic approach to defining a villain and evil in fantasy. In my personal opinion, this theory is depicted no better than within Kentaro Miller's masterfully written series known infamously as Berserk. The true definition of a dark fantasy story, for Berserk contains within it some of the most gut-wrenching and horrific events and fragments of storytelling ever put to paper. However, despite its reputation for brutal, dark and Marakure themes, it truly shines with its character dynamic, more specifically how the story handles good and evil, especially how it blurs the lines between the two. At first glance, you will already be tricked by Berserk, as we see Griffith, the holy angelic man, and Guts, the brutal hound of hell. Instantaneously, you will without a doubt presume Griffith must be the hero. A classical knight in shining armour have come to save the princess and defeat the witch or Dark Lord, while Guts must be that very same Dark Lord. The truth is, this is a complete lie. For in simple understanding, Guts is the hero and Griffith is the cold, sadistic villain. Although Berserk doesn't just redefine the concept of good and evil with how it visualises its characters, but also with the story itself. For Guts is in no way your standard hero. Rather, he has no guilt in butchering innocent people on his blood-soaked path for revenge. If you were to turn a blind eye to his goal of killing Griffith, Guts appears far more evil than he does heroic, and yet this man is somehow the hero at the core of the story. Griffith is also very similar in this aspect, as he was once a hero who Guts and many others respected and trusted, even beyond themselves, and yet he would succumb to his dream and sacrifice everyone he held dear so that he could gain little more than power. In the world of Berserk, Guts nor Griffith are truly evil or truly good. Some share qualities of both elements, and this is how Kentaro Miura truly blurred the lines between good and evil, unlike anyone before him. In truth, he broke the line completely, having his two main characters be twisted with both good and evil in shallow form, such as their appearance, and also within their deep roots and cores with their actions, personality, past, and more. Now that we have discovered clear evidence of the lines separating good and evil having been blurred over the years, we must now ask why. Why has this change occurred? The truth is, I believe this change happened due to real-world history. Dating back to cinema post-World War II, Nazis quickly became the common villain in film. This can be seen with countless pictures releasing in the few decades post-World War II, including the Indiana Jones franchise, The Marathon Man, The Boys from Brazil, and countless other titles. This is where I believe the focus on pure evil Nazified villains were made the new norm, so it would be easier for audiences to relate to the good and the evil. A clear example of this is in Star Wars, since the Empire at its foundation is a reimagined Nazi party. George Lucas even specifically stated himself he sought to make the Galactic Empire aesthetically and thematically similar to Nazi Germany, and to appear fascist, even going so far to say and to copy ideas and themes from the Nazis themselves, such as stormtroopers and dreadnoughts. The Vietnam War was a major conflict in which, for the first time in modern history, people began to see that there is no true hero and villain when it comes to something as hauntingly devastating as war. After all, the Americans committed atrocities in the hundreds alongside the Vietnamese forces. Unlike the depictions of World War II, that majorly showcased the Allies as the good, benevolent white knights in shining armour, and the Axis as the evil dark lords, the Vietnam War saw no such treatment. In truth, the Americans were often depicted as being just as corrupt and evil as the Vietnamese forces, but in the end no side could be described as the right or the wrong. This in turn caused for the seeds of inspiration to be planted as the general public saw for themselves, for the first time in modern history, it isn't as simple as good versus evil in the real world, thus allowing the cinema industry to develop such ideas and characters with their own works, needing not to worry about audience backlash or confusing, allowing for the line separating good and evil to finally begin to blur. In short, I believe the Vietnam War was what altered the concepts of good and evil in film, including the fantasy genre, since it placed a magnifying glass on human nature and how even those shown and draped in glory can still carry dirty blood on their hands. In conclusion, I believe Martin F. Norden is very much correct, and the concept of good and evil has changed, especially within the fantasy genre, mainly because of the Vietnam War altering people's opinions on the concepts of pure evil, allowing for the birth of new ideas, for instance, sympathetic villains, villains with good motivations, broken villains, grey characters, anti-heroes, anti-villains, heroes becoming villains, villains becoming heroes, and countless new other concepts and ideals conceived and developed, allowing film to evolve the basis of good and evil into something not only more impactful, in turn allowing for greater storytelling, but also something far more closely tied to realism.